Greetings and welcome to the fourth and last lecture on Machiavelli. And I want to summarize this by going back to the central concept for Machiavelli, which is power. And I want to focus in on a table in your textbook. I believe it's table 3.1 on how to maintain power. But before I do, I want to make an observation. And this is an opinion of mine. I didn't get this one from anyone else in particular, but as I was reading through the chapter and thinking back to when I had to read The Prince and when I was taking political theory, one of the things that comes to me as I look at this notion of maintaining power is that Machiavelli, as a political realist, it seems to me he equates power with force. And certainly force is one component of power. But I would argue that power has multiple components. There are other ways to exert power. And remember, for me, power is a behavior. Power is the ability to get someone to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And so think about your life. I mean, we exist in society, and there are lots of ways that we try to influence people to do things that have nothing to do with force. For example, one of the most common means of power to me is persuasion, right? Persuasion. So someone makes a speech trying to persuade you to think a particular way. Or someone may write an article. Certainly you may listen to, say, a presidential debate where both, very soon, Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump are going to debate. Both of them are trying to influence you to vote for them, trying to get you to do something you wouldn't otherwise do. First, maybe to vote, and then second, to vote for them. There are other means of power, and one of my very favorites is exchange, right? So in order to get someone to do something, right? So, you may, in my case, may want my son or daughter to do something. They may not want to do it. And I may say, well, if you'll do that, I'll give you, I don't know, say $50. So there's an exchange, right? They really don't want to do this, but for $50, they could be persuaded. So the point I think that I'm making is that Machiavelli discusses force as a type of power, but I actually think that power is multidimensional. And I think actually in the long term, persuasion and exchange are usually, not always, but are usually more effective in terms of exerting power over the long term than is force. Now, don't get me wrong. I think I've mentioned in an earlier mini lecture, my favorite political quote is by Al Capone, who said, "A smile will get you a lot, but a smile and a gun will get you a whole lot more." Certainly, that seems like Machiavelli on steroids. And certainly, if someone comes into the room with a gun, they probably can get you to do a whole bunch of things in the short term. But I think that Machiavelli misses out in his analysis on discussing these elements, these other elements of power, which may be persuasion, even manipulation, and certainly exchange. So that's just an overview in terms of my thinking as I was looking at that chapter. Most of the things in the box I've already touched on, but I just want to go over it one last time. Obviously, there are, I believe, 7 or 8 of them. in the box, right? That the prince should be strong as a lion and cunning as a fox. All right, there's no question that you should be strong, decisive, have a reputation. You should be very, very smart. Machiavelli makes the claim it's best to be feared and loved, but better to be feared than loved. And certainly I will ask you that question on the exam. I think I'll also ask you about the prince should be strong as a lion and cunning as a fox. I may use different animals, and if I do, it's false. And if I say lion and fox, it's true. I told you that not everyone agrees with that notion, and I'm not sure that I agree that it's best to be feared uh, than it is loved. Certainly, I think Cicero makes an equally good case for the opposite. I do agree that avoid being hated because it's harder to control people in this emotional state. And certainly, I would agree with that because if you are hated, that becomes part of your reputation. And I do agree with Machiavelli that reputation, credibility, those things are very, very important. Inflict necessary injury early, give benefits slowly. Okay, I don't really have an opinion on that. Be decisive and strong. I like this one. Do not delegate important powers to subordinates and choose good ministers, not flatterers. And there's an excellent book called Victims of Groupthink. It's an old book. It was written by a man named Irving Janis. And Janis actually talks about what Machiavelli is talking about here. Uh, in this case, leaders who got in trouble because they only selected yes men and people who would tell them what they wanted to hear. And I'll give you an example. When Lyndon Johnson became president, he had a group who would give him advice. They called themselves the Tuesday Lunch Group, which tells you they met on Tuesdays for lunch. Early on in Johnson's presidency, he had a nice mix of people who were for the Vietnam War and people who were against the Vietnam War. And intelligence began coming in that perhaps this war was not winnable. Perhaps the United States should disengage from the war and get out. And a couple of advisors, two advisors in particular, George Ball and Bill Moyers, started coming to this Tuesday lunch group with things that the president needed to hear. The problem is the other people in the group began to gang up on these two and began calling them names, right? Negative names. Oh, here comes Mr. Peace, Mr. Love, Mr. Don't Drop the Bomb, right? And various other things. And the group was so merciless to these two men that both Moyers and Ball ended up resigning. They resigned their positions. And so the only people who were left in this group that was advising President Johnson were flatterers, were people who were telling the president exactly what he wanted to hear, even though intelligence came in which suggested the war was not going well, that perhaps Ho Chi Minh, who was the North Vietnamese leader, was seen as the legitimate leader of Vietnam, and that the United States was increasingly seen as an imperialist who was propping up puppet regimes that really were designed to promote American interests and not Vietnamese interests. And because there was no conscience in that group, because they weren't good ministers, to use Machiavelli's phrase, and because Johnson only heard what he wanted to hear, Johnson continued to commit the United States to a war that was destined to failure. So I think that Machiavelli has a very, very, very important observation here when he talks about choosing good ministers and not flatterers. And let me give you a good example of a president who did this, in my opinion, right. Abraham Lincoln, when he ran for the presidency, had, I believe, four major opponents who ran against him essentially for the primary to be the Republican nominee for president. And what's interesting is that when Lincoln became president, he brought his critics into the White House, in the cabinet, as sources of advice, so that Lincoln on a regular basis heard a multitude of opinions and told him the things he needed to hear, even if he didn't always agree with them. So I really, really like that be decisive and strong, because I think presidents who do that get better information, leaders who do that get better information, and flatterers can result in disaster. In the box, he also says, build religion into the state, but don't actually be religious. I talked about that earlier. It is interesting to me that Machiavelli makes the observation that people are more likely to obey the laws if God is watching and judging their behavior. Although notice that he had also said that he believed that religion weakened leaders. So in this particular case, religion can have a purpose kind of in creating greater legitimacy for the law, because God might judge them. He also says to appear to be trustworthy, but be willing to break commitments when necessary. Again, the chief objective is holding on to power, to keep up appearances, to uphold customs and practices. So Machiavelli is very intriguing. I do believe he is a transformational figure. I do consider him the first modern political theorist in Europe, and that he is a bridge from those normative theorists. And normative theorists, both in ancient political thought, and I talked about the ancient Greeks, and your book didn't really talk about the theologians, but obviously in the medieval period, the notion of good and evil and justice. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, during the medieval period, distinguished between just wars that were legitimized by God and unjust wars, for example. So certainly this notion on what should be and the normative tradition is dominant in the pre-modern world. Machiavelli transforms that, says that instead of justice being the key analysis in politics, it should be power. Now, I think Machiavelli's notion of power is a little crude and it's one-dimensional, and I think it should be more multidimensional. But The Prince has been widely read throughout history. It can be viewed two ways. One on perhaps how to rule, especially if you're an authoritarian. But I think it can also be read as what to fear, what the people should fear in a leader, because the things that it takes to be an effective authoritarian might be repugnant to the interests. And of course, in the discourses, Machiavelli sounded very, very different. And so some say that this wasn't just an appeal to the Medicis, to curry favor. That certainly could be one component, but the other could be, here is what can happen when there is a concentration of power and someone who understands how to use it ruthlessly and effectively. We're done with Machiavelli. In the next lecture, we move to Thomas Hobbes, and now we begin to see some real influences on our political system. Take care. Hope you have a great day.